Hey guys, Josiah here at EasyCaters.com. I've been doing a lot of trades lately using my time-based relative volume indicators, and I had some questions come in about how to get those set up. So I wanted to go ahead and just do a quick video explaining how to add those to the chart, adjust the settings, and get them kind of configured, at least the way that I use them. So here I've got the two studies highlighted here. I've got the relative time-based relative volume and the time-based relative shares per trade. Now the relative volume can be used for either the share volume or the tick count. You can use either, you can set it to either one. So if you want the relative tick count, you would just, or a trade count, trade volume, then you would change it to tick count there and apply that setting, and that would it would colorize the volume based on tick count. Now when you first add this, a lot of times when you just double click it, it automatically goes onto the price graph area of Thinkorswim, and you might end up with something that looks a little bit like this, which is kind of confusing. But the deal is here that I made this so that it can be used as an upper price graph paint bar study or as a lower histogram study. You just drag it to whichever one you want, and then if you want it only on the upper price graph, you just turn off the you say hide volume subgraph, so that hides these plot lines, and instead just colorizes the individual candles for you. So I tried to make it a little flexible there so that you could use it for either a lower study or an upper study, just for the paint bars functionality. Same thing with the time-based shares per trade as well. When you double click it initially, it'll go up here, and if I don't have this one on here, it will yeah, so if I don't have the hide volume subgraph setting turned on, then you'll see something like this, which, you know, is the same deal there. You just want to turn that off if you want to use it as an upper study only. I do like to have it separated out, actually, so I'm going to tell it to not hide the subgraph, and I'm going to drag it down to this lower subgraph area so it will plot the histogram and colorize the price candles for me. And that just lets me see a little bit more detail of what it looks like, how big the variations are, and so forth. Let me go ahead and pull up the time-based volume as well. So I'm going to drag that down here. I'm actually going to add two instances of the time-based volume, and I'm going to set one of them to be tick count and one to be share count. And so I've got the share volume and the tick volume here, and then I've got the shares per tick. Now I'm only going to want to, so that there's not any confusion here, I'm not going to show the paint bars for the volume studies. I'm going to turn the paint bars off for those two and only leave the paint bars turned on for the shares per tick. And so you can see that the colorization here for the shares per tick is actually what's driving the coloration up here on the price graph. And the other two, they're still coloring the lower graph areas based on their readings, but that's not affecting the price graph area up here. So right away you can kind of see that you've got some high shares per trade readings up here in these greens, high shares per trade on these bright reds, and then varying degrees of increased shares per trades throughout the day. You can see these different areas. Like here's a nice little breakdown with increased shares per trade as we started kind of this downtrend here. I started confirming it, at least. Same thing there, and so forth. But as far as changing these settings, a lot of times you'll notice, like if if on the particular stock or instrument that you trade, you see a ton of just bright colored bars all the time, then that might be a situation where you need to adjust the thresholds on the indicator. So by default, with the shares per trade, the shares per trade is usually going to only kind of oscillate back and forth in a very narrow range. So you can see here I've got the low of this graph area is 50% of the average, and the high is 150% of the average. And you can see how I've got that set here. I've got the first threshold for coloration to be 100%. So after the shares per trade gets to 100%, it colors instead of being the very, very dark color, it highlights it just a little bit. Then when it reaches 120, it highlights it a little more. Reaches 130, highlights that a little more, and then finally reaches 150, and it highlights it the bright color. But if you're seeing a ton of the bright color, then you might want to raise these thresholds a little bit so that it's harder, it requires the indicator to reach an even more extreme value before it starts highlighting the bars. So you might raise these to say 110, 130, 150, 170 or something like that. And so that would make it harder for it to highlight at those brighter colors and make it a little bit easier to look at and see the variations a little bit better. It just depends on the individual instrument that you're trading. If you change between, say, futures or stocks or whatever you're looking at, those might have different characteristics, volume characteristics that might need to be customized and hone in the settings for. You can also change the look-back days. This is the number of days that it adds up the volume for each particular bar for. So I have this set to 25. So let's say for this, this is almost 11:30. For this 11:30 bar, it's looking at 11:30 a.m. over the past 25 days and saying how many shares per trade were done for that particular 11:30 a.m. bar, and then how many do we have today compared to that average. And so it looks at the average for just that bar over the past 25 days or whatever number you put here. And so the longer the better probably, but you might get different results, change it to 10, 15, 20, 25, something like that. I try to keep it as long as possible, but you can do as you please there. This you can adjust the coloration if you don't like the particular colors I chose. You can change all that here. If you only want to show the paint bars and not the colorized volume, if you just want a solid color down here, you can change that as well. I don't know why you would want to do that really, but just FYI, that settings there. And you have these little tooltips here that kind of explain each setting. I try to make it pretty obvious, but I do have these little tooltips to give you a hint if you get stuck on the individual settings there. Now, if you don't want to use the shares per trade and you kind of want to separate it out a little bit more, and maybe you want to use relative, let's just go with ticks for now. Let's see. So let's go to show paint bars, turn that on for this, and so now you're going to see basically when the tape speed increased, when the relative number of trades happening in a given bar increased over the average. So you can see this was kind of like a climactic move right here, and both the share count and the tick count increased as that came up to the high of the day, and that put in the high for the rest of the day. You have similar spikes in the tick count or the tape speed. As we're doing this run up, we have you can view this in different ways. You can see this as churn, Um, Basically, it's just saying that the tape is increasing in speed, so a lot of times you'll see that happen during a breakout as a lot of orders come piling in, and so you can see the breakout happening here above this level in the morning, and a continuation here, and then on narrower bars, a lot of times this is like a churn for a turnover, a rollover of the trend. So a lot of times you'll see this high volume churn happen, or the high tick count churn, meaning that on a narrow range bar, that can mean that you're encountering some resistance, and all those orders are not making the stock move any farther. So that is kind of indicating that it's hitting some supply there, or some demand that it can't get through. That regardless of how many orders the market throws at it, it's not moving, it's not budging. So that can indicate that there's some resistance there, and it might be reversing. And that's kind of what happened here. Had some let's see here, we had some high tick count come in down here at the bottom as this reversed back up, kind of changing the trend here. So we have this down spike, then a more gradual retracement down to this low, and I'm guessing that there were some big traders that were watching this retrace down to the low here, right at the kind of high of the opening range over here. And so this was like a double bottom, and some orders really piled in as this became a double bottom and confirmed. And then some more orders came back here on the pullback and on the breakout here. Some churn happened here as it encountered resistance over this high of this pivot, and so it had to churn through that resistance, but it was able to overcome that resistance and move on forward and come up to this high. Then you had another churn bar happen here, showing that there was some resistance there, that it, in the narrowing range, that it just couldn't get through, and this turned it around. And so you had lots of different signals here. So that's the relative shares per, the relative trades indicator. You can see it's nice to keep an eye on these differentials, and this is kind of what the shares per trade indicator does. You can see here that there was a spike in relative volume, but not nearly as high of a spike in relative trades. So basically what that says is there was a really big order waiting right here. When you see that kind of discrepancy happen, that means somebody with a lot of money stepped in right there. And same thing here. We had a lot of shares change hands, but not a lot of trades. The trade count was low, the volume count was high, so this was a place where somebody stepped in with a big order. Let's see if there are any other signals like that. This was higher tick count and not quite as high of share count. So that can be interesting as well. It's like public interest, maybe maybe that's a place where actually novices piled in to go long, or something like that, and but were actually stopped out as it rolled back over. So sometimes you can look for those kind of things. When the trade count is high but the volume count is low, sometimes that can mean that there are a lot of tiny orders, like small players that might be doing something foolish. So you can kind of look out for that. So let's see here. Let's move over to the share count. And so I'm going to turn off the paint bars for the relative shares per trade and turn on the paint bars for the relative volume. And so now, whoops, I think I changed the setting here. Show paint bars. Yes, do not hide volume subgraph. There we go. And so, okay, so this kind of illustrates what I said a minute ago about how a high share count order came in right here and stopped this. It looks like it probably stopped this pullback. Somebody maybe stepped in here, or maybe, you know, it could have actually been on the breakdown as well. You can't really tell because this was a breakdown bar. It might have been a market maker absorbing this drop, or it could have been an actual large order that was afraid that the market was going to be selling off. But a lot of times you'll see the larger share counts come in at ideal locations, and so you can see that there were a lot of shares that came in right here as the uptrend started for the day, and a lot of shares came in here at the very top of the day. And we had several other locations where large shares stepped in expectation of a breakout, continuation of this upward move. Right as it broke above this pivot high here, shares came in. As it kind of continued above this, looks like some shares came in there. And then kind of we finally had this kind of climactic move up here, some churn, and then the breakdown. So there's lots of different signals you can look out for with these, but generally what I look for is I like to see where the larger orders are. I'm looking for, you know, what the typically what would be considered the smart money are doing. And so you can see when we have, like, here's another example, the high shares, low ticks, lower than the share count anyway, indicating there's some large orders stepping in right there, and that can be an indication that the move is about to change directions. Let's see here, we had high ticks and high volume come in through here, and that kind of showed an exhaustion to the move. You have high ticks, that can mean there's some public participation there, a lot of people getting scared and getting washed out. Let's see here if there are any good additional signals here that we can take a look at. Yeah. So there's lots of different ways to look at this. The way that I have found for me that I like the best as far as my own analysis is to sort of move the relative volume analysis to the Equivolume chart, which is a functionality built into Thinkorswim. So what you can do is go to Style, Chart Type, Equivolume, and so this changes your graph type to an Equivolume chart, where the width of the candle is a type of relative volume reading. It's not a time-based relative volume reading, but it can stand in for that, especially when you're using a time-based shares per trade indicator like I have. So I like to use the Equivolume charts combined with the shares per trade indicator. And so I'm going to set all those, hit apply. Oh, and I think I turned it on hide subgraph, so I need to check that. No. And so now we can see both when there is high share count with the width of the candle and when there is a high relative number of shares per each order. So here we have like a high volume candle, but it's actually not that above average in terms of shares per trade. And the same thing with the open of the day. It is high volume, but not necessarily that high in a shares per trade perspective. So I'm going to switch over here to MU, which is one of my favorite stocks to trade with this method. And maybe try to look for some of these signals that I've had over the past few days here. Yesterday, I had this low volume. So the way I look at this is I want to see a move with some, I guess, some impetus, or some power behind it, and then I want to see a puny low volume pullback against that move. And so you can kind of see here we had this strong move up, kind of a strong leg here. This pulled us up above the MA, and then you can see these super dark, low commitment, puny, low volume, low width of the candle, and low commitment, meaning low shares per trade, indicating that the only people selling here were really just some small traders taking some profits, nothing major going on there. And so this is my ideal setup right here. I want to see some strength in one direction and weakness in the opposite direction, and then I want to buy against the weakness. So I buy on a break above this red low volume, low commitment candle. And so this was my trade yesterday that worked out really well. And here are a couple other entries that showed up as well. This one was valid in my plan, where we had this strength in the upward direction, strength, 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 showing commitment toward the upside, both in terms of shares per trade and in terms of actual shares. And then we have these lighter volume pullbacks to the MA, bottoming tail, small narrow candle there, and that's a perfect entry right there as well. This one was not as good because it had a little bit of commitment come in, higher shares per trade, but it's low volume. The volume is not as big as this, the preceding green candles. There's predominantly green candles in here, bright green coming in. And we've got this light volume, small range, bottoming tail. This is a valid entry as well. This would have been a valid entry here too, and depending on where your stop was, it could have worked or it could have stopped you out, either one. But anyway, that was a picture perfect couple of trades there all the way up to the top. And then we have this topping tail, kind of a short squat candle, and actually several groups of candles as well, kind of indicating some resistance there. Not no ability to kind of move beyond that at that point. And so that's that was the end of the move, at least temporarily there. So, and you can kind of see the same thing right here at this top. This was a good low volume pullback as well. Not as good because of this higher commitment candle here, but it kind of illustrate what I'm looking for as well. Like, you get this larger strength move, lighter volumes, tiny candles pulling back to the MA, and then large volume coming back out, and large commitment. This was not as good of a pullback, so I didn't actually buy this yesterday because of this too high of strength coming back to the MA. I didn't really like the look of that, but it would have worked as well for 2 hours, it looks like. So anyway, that's how I like to look at it, because as you can see with the relative volume and ticks, sometimes there are some very subtle differences between the bar sizes, where you might have high volume and high ticks, but one is not quite as high as the other. And so the really important thing I found is to look at that tiny difference. The tiny difference between how extreme the volume is versus how extreme the shares or the tick count is. And when there's a discrepancy or a kind of a divergence there, then that's where the shares per trade indicator comes in and gives you a nice signal. And so you can see here, there's a really nice divergence showing some stopping volume. This was the low of the afternoon, and it happened on high shares per trade. So that's the way I look at it. I'm always, working on improving this method, but I've found it to be fairly reliable when you're looking for, a move. You're above the MA. You've got strength in your direction, and then you have a tiny, puny pullback against that direction. That is a picture-perfect way to enter your trade with low risk and high reward potential. So anyway, that's how I trade, and I wanted to just kind of walk through getting those set up, how to read the different settings or signals that they give you, and how to adjust the settings. All of these might need adjusted based on the particular symbols that you're trading. If you get too many high volume bars, then you can, like I said, you can adjust those thresholds upward. But anyway, that's how I look at it, and I'll be posting some more videos soon. If you find this valuable, please hit like and subscribe. You can check out the website at easykaters.com, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.